Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Well, today, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, was spotted in Washington, D.C., outside of a fairly famous pizzeria. I'm just kidding. He was actually spotted inside the pizzeria. I'm just kidding again. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. So, yes, he is here. He is here with hand out asking for money. He needs money. He has to have money. I mean, don't we all? We all need money. Now, so far, the Ukrainians have received close to $100 billion in U.S. aid, with about $30 billion of that, plus or minus, as a direct infusion of cash, hard currency, digital currency, what have you. At this point, that is actually probably be more important to this man here than actual military equipment. He needs that cash. He needs that cash to continue to prop up his government, to pay military leaders, to pay political, quote-unquote, leaders, and to continue the war. If that cash is not handed over, then the Ukrainian economy collapses. And it's on the verge of collapse as we speak. Now, in addition to that $29-30 billion that the U.S. has handed over, is tens of billions in military aid. So as we speak right now, the amount of military aid that has been given to the Ukrainian state, both military and cash, direct cash, exceeds the entire military budget of most Western European nation states. Not all European nation states combined, individual major powers such as France, Germany, the United Kingdom. Even Russia, prior to the onset of hostilities, the Russian defense budget did not exceed the amount given to the Ukrainians so far. Now the question is, how much more does the United States need to give the Ukrainians? How long is this going to last, and how much? The Joseph Biden administration would have you believe that the United States must continue to cut checks and hand over military aid in perpetuity to the Ukrainians. That's not reasonable. Look, the amount of money, cash, that $29-30 billion that was handed over to the Ukrainians, that equals the entire budget for 1 year for NASA, the National Air and Space Administration. It's not a small amount of money. Now, how long? We're going to give another $100, $105, $110 billion to the Ukrainians. Next year, are we going to give $150 billion to the Ukrainians? I don't know. How much? Reconstruction, if and when the war ends. What does that look like? After all is said and done, is Ukraine worth $1 trillion? $1 trillion. Again, most people here in the United States, prior to and even now, I would argue, cannot locate Ukraine on the map. The Vice President of the United States could not locate Ukraine on a map. The pizzeria, absolutely, but not Ukraine on a map. Now, this war has no end date in sight. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. It is going to continue. Now, we keep hearing in the United States that, well, if Ukraine falls, and I'm not sure exactly what that means, because I don't believe at this point Russia has the ability to occupy all of Ukraine. They can occupy parts of Ukraine, but not all of it. After, quote-unquote, Ukraine falls, after the Ukraine falls, what happens next? What's next? Well, Vladimir alleges that another nation state will be next, meaning Russia will then, after going through this brutal multi-year war with Ukraine, will then attack another neighbor. We got darts. Let's break out some darts, and let's just start throwing darts at the map. Is it going to be Poland? Is Russia going to attack Poland next? No, the Russians are not going to attack Poland. Poland is probably, I would say at this point, one of the top 3 most powerful militaries in all of NATO. And then obviously if Russia were to attack Poland, at least part of NATO would come to the aid of Poland in terms of direct military intervention, including probably the United States. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Could they be next? Possibly. Is it outside the realm of possibility that the Russians would seek to occupy Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania? Maybe. How does that impact the United States? Well, I don't think it does. For decades, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were part of the Soviet Union. For all you Cold War personnel out there, you remember when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union. Now, again, is it likely that the Russians will attack Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania? No, not at all. But the decision to accept Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania into this NATO alliance was probably not a prudent decision. It would be very difficult for NATO to defend Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Much more difficult than it would be to defend Poland. But at the end of the day, is it reasonable to think that the Russians are going to enter the Baltic states? Probably not. Then who else? Who else are the Russians going to attack? Is it Finland? Are the Russians going to attack Finland? Are the Russians going to march in and try to seize Helsinki? Well, at one point, Finland was part of the Russian Empire. But the likelihood of a successful Russian invasion of Finland, I would say at this point, would be rather remote. It would be incredibly costly, and in all likelihood, you would see direct military intervention by other nation states. So I think the Russians would think twice before moving on Finland. Again, probably the most likely target in this fantasy-driven narrative of the next country that will be next would be the Baltic states. But that likelihood is incredibly remote. This fantasy about a Russian military that drives westward and threatens Poland, Germany, France, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, the Czech and Slovak republics, which, remember, were actually part of the Warsaw Pact. I mean, Poland was part of the Warsaw Pact. But that likelihood is incredibly remote. Incredibly unlikely. Just in terms of capabilities and the ability of the Russian army to make that kind of move westward would be near impossible, especially if the United States intervened. The Russians and the Soviet Union did not make that move in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. Didn't happen. So it's not going to happen in the future as well. So when you hear that narrative, if Ukraine falls, and again, the whole narrative of Ukraine falling, you have to look at on its own. Most likely, it will be a territorial defensive acquisition by the Russians of parts of eastern Ukraine. Yes, there may be more areas taken by the Russians. But will it be the entire state of the borderlands, Ukraine? No, it's not. In all likelihood, worst case scenario for Ukraine at this point would be the loss of all territory east of the Dnieper River. But look, we're not even close to that even happening yet. Okay? There is a lot of heavy fighting that has to take place before we even start to even look at that. I mean, we're not even at the point where we can rationally say that Kharkov is going to fall, is going to come under the control of the Russians, much less Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, some of these areas. Now, these areas in the east, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, we could see that those cities eventually fall in an upcoming Russian offensive, especially if the Ukrainian military starts to collapse because it's not being provided with cash infusions from the United States and perpetual weapon systems and munitions being handed over to the Ukrainians by the United States. So, what do we have to look forward to? Probably, at the very least, another 2 to 3 years of armed conflict. Unless the Russians are able to defeat the Ukrainian military in the field and force some sort of political change in Ukraine that eventually ends hostilities. Because look, the Russians are not going to stop. Not when it comes to Ukraine. But the end of Ukraine does not mean the Russians are going to march into Western Europe. I don't think they have that capability. I think if the Russians tried to move west, even towards Poland, and the U.S. intervened, and certain Western NATO states also assisted, the Russians would be militarily defeated. They wouldn't be able to do it. And the Russians know that. And that's why they would not move against Western Europe. We will continue to watch stuff very, very closely. We're probably on the verge of the Ukrainian evacuation of the Eastern Bank. There's those couple of Ukrainian naval infantry marine battalions that are operating on the Eastern Bank. That is probably going to resolve itself with a Ukrainian retreat. We're also continuing to watch the Russians batter Ukrainian forces along the line of contact running from Zaporizhzhia all the way to the north towards Kupiansk. We expect that to continue with unrelenting persistence, and we will continue to monitor. Thank you for joining us today. As always, have a good day.